de la tasa de interés
The pace of those
próximamente que va a
increases will
seguir
continue to depend on the
en las
incoming
próximas
data
reuniones
and the evolving
siga
outlook for the
bajando la
economy.
inflación.
With today's action, we have raised interest rates by 3 percentage points this year. At some point,
Hemos
as the
aumentado un
stance of
total de
monetary policy
3%
tightens
este
further,
año en
it will
la
become
tasa de
appropriate to
interés.
slow the pace of increases while we assess how our cumulative policy adjustments are affecting the economy and inflation. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting and communicate our
Hemos
thinking as clearly as
hecho
possible.
nuestra decisión todos los meetings,
Restoring
todas las
price
reuniones,
stability
y lo
will likely
seguiremos
require
haciendo
maintaining a
próximamente
restrictive policy stance for some
para bajar
time.
la inflación.
The historical record cautions strongly against
La inflación
prematurely
más
loosening
alta
policy.
en 40 años
As
en los
shown in
Estados
the
Unidos.
SEP, the median projection for the appropriate level of the federal funds rate is 4.4% at the end of this year, 1 percentage point higher than projected in June. The median projection rises to 4.6% at the end of next year and declines to 2.9% by the end of 2025, still above the median estimate of its longer run value.
Presidente de la Reserva
Of
Federal
course, these
habló que
projections
acaban de
do not
aumentar la
represent a
tasa de
committee
interés
decision or
75
plan,
puntos
and no one
básicos
knows with any
nuevamente
certainty
aquí
where
en
the
los Estados
economy will
Unidos. Se
be a year or
esperaba
more from
entre
now.
75 puntos básicos a 100
We are
puntos
taking
básicos.
forceful and rapid steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored.
Seguiremos usando
Reducing
nuestras
inflation is
herramientas,
likely to
que
require
siempre
a
él habla de esta
sustained
herramienta.
period
La
of
herramienta
below-trend
es
growth.
aumentar la
And
tasa
there
de
will very
interés
likely be some
para traer
softening of
abajo
labor
la
market
inflación
conditions.
a los niveles
Restoring price stability
prepandémicos.
is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. We
A
will
largo
keep at
tiempo
it until we're
esperamos ver
confident the job is
nuevamente
done.
los precios que se estabilicen.
To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families,
Para
and businesses
terminar,
across the
entendemos que
country.
nuestras acciones de
Everything we
aumentar
do
la
is
tasa
in
de
service
interés
to
va a
our
afectar a
public
las
mission.
comunidades,
We at the Fed
también
will do everything we can
a las
to achieve our
personas
maximum
de
employment
bajos
and price
recursos.
stability goals. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Espero las preguntas ahora. Aumento histórico nuevamente en los
Hi,
Estados
Chair Powell.
Unidos,
Thank you for taking
75
our
puntos
question.
básicos la
James
tasa de
Smiley from the New
interés.
York Times. I wonder if you could give us a little detail around how you'll know when to slow down these rate increases and how you'll
Quiero que
eventually
nos
know when
diga
to stop.
a la nación, ¿cuándo esperan ustedes
So
bajar
I will answer your
este
question
agresivo de la
directly,
tasa
but
de
I want to
interés?
start here today by saying that my main message has not changed at all since
Mi mensaje no ha
Jackson Hole.
cambiado.
The FOMC is strongly resolved to bring inflation down to 2%.
Estamos
we will
enfocados
keep
en
at
traer
it
la
until the
inflación a
job is done.
2%.
So the way we're thinking about this is
¿Cómo queremos hacer esto?
the overarching focus of the committee is getting inflation back down to 2%.
Queremos bajar
To accomplish
esto a
that, we think
2%
we'll
de
need to do two
inflación.
things in particular to achieve a period of growth below trend and also some softening in labor market conditions to foster a better balance between demand and supply in the labor market.
Queremos que la demanda
So on the
también
first,
se anivele
committee's forecasts and
con
those
la
of most
oferta
outside forecasters do
para que
show growth
podamos
running
llevar a
below
nuestro
its longer
propósito
run
más
potential
rápido.
this year and next year. On the second, though, so far there's only modest evidence that the labor market is cooling off. Job openings are down a bit. As you know, quits are off their all-time highs. There's some signs that some wage
Sí,
measures
muchas
may be
personas han
flattening
dejado
out,
su
but
trabajo
not moving up. Payroll gains have moderated, but
y
not
menos,
much.
dice él
And in
ahora,
light of the
en lo que está leyendo, que hay menos trabajos
high inflation we're
disponibles.
seeing, we think we'll need to, and in light of what I just said, we think that we'll need to bring
Que
our
se han
funds
frenado
rate
un poco la
to
fuerza laboral,
a
no mucho.
restrictive level and to keep it there for some time. So
Al principio
what will
dijo
we
que
be
estaba
looking
muy
at, I
fuerte.
guess, is your
Ahora
question.
dijo
So
que se ha enfriado un
we'll
poco.
be looking at a few things. First, we'll want to see growth continuing to run below trend. We'll want to see movements in the labor market showing a return to a better balance between supply and demand. And ultimately, we'll want to see clear evidence that inflation is moving back down
Queremos que
to
mientras se
2%.
anivele la oferta y la demanda,
So
podamos
that's what
ver
we'll be looking
también
for.
que empieza a bajar
In
más
terms of
agresivamente la inflación aquí en los
reducing
Estados Unidos
rates, I
y
think
nuestro
we'd want
propósito
to
es
be
que
very
baje al
confident that
2%.
inflation is moving back down to 2% before we
Nuevamente,
would consider that.
esperamos que esto suceda próximamente a largo tiempo, al 2% que podamos ver en la
Thank you, Mr.
inflación.
Chairman. Steve Leisman, CNBC. Can you talk about how you factor in the variable lags on inflation and the extent to which the outlook for rates should be seen as linear in the sense that you keep raising rates? Or can you envision a time when there's a pause to kind of look at what has been wrought in the economy from the rate increases? Thank you.
Sí, si siguen aumentando la tasa de interés,
So,
¿cuándo piensan ustedes también
Of
hacer
course,
una
monetary
pausa
policy
para ver también
does
los problemas en
famously
la
work with
economía
long and
que tiene
variable
que
lags.
ver también con
The
esta
way I
alza
think
de
of it
interés?
is our policy decisions affect financial conditions immediately. In fact, financial conditions have usually been affected well before we actually announce our decisions. Then changes in financial conditions begin to affect economic activity fairly quickly, within a few months. But it's likely to take some time to see the full effects of changing financial conditions on inflation. So we are
Sí, el
very much
problema
mindful
económico de
for
la
that.
inflación,
And that's why I noted in my
esto va a tardar
opening
un poco
remarks
de
that
tiempo para que lo
at some
podamos
point,
ver.
as the stance of policy tightens further, it will become appropriate to slow the pace of rate hikes while we assess how our cumulative policy adjustments are affecting the economy and inflation. So that's how we think about that. Your second question, sorry, was?
Is there a point in time you could see pausing? Is it linear that you keep raising rates, or is there? Oh, I'm sorry. I should know better.
Va a haber un momento donde van a pausar para
should know better than to answer
analizar
your
esta
second
situación o van a seguir aumentando la tasa de
Oh,
interés.
there you go. Is it linear? Do you keep raising rates, or is there a pause that you could envision where you kind of figure out what has happened to the economy and give time to catch up in the real economy, the rate increase time to catch up in the real economy? Thank you.
So I think it's very hard to say with precise certainty the way this is going to unfold. As I mentioned, what we
Creo que
think
es
we
muy
need to
difícil
do and
decir
should do is
exactamente
to move our
cómo
policy
esto
rate to
se
a
va a mover
restrictive level that's
adelante.
restrictive enough to bring inflation down to 2%, where we have
No
confidence of
podemos
that.
decir
And
con
what you
exactitud
see in
qué es
the
lo que va a
SEP
suceder
numbers is people's
próximamente.
views as of
Nuestro enfoque
today,
es bajar
as of
la
this
inflación
meeting,
al
as to
2%,
the kind of levels
lo
that will
que
be
es
appropriate. Now, those
saludable para la economía en
will
los
evolve
Estados
over
Unidos.
time. And I think we'll just have to see how that goes. There is a
Tenemos que ver
possibility
cómo
certainly
todo
that we
se
would go to
desenvuelve
a
hacia
certain
adelante
level that we're confident
y sí
in
lo
and
podemos
stay there for a time.
lograr.
But we're not at that level. Clearly
Pero no
today,
estamos en ese nivel
we're
todavía.
just we've just moved, I think, probably into the very lowest level of what might be restrictive. And certainly in my view and in the view of the committee, there's a ways to go.
Acaban de aumentar la tasa de interés en los
Rachel
Estados Unidos
Siegel from Washington Post. Thank you
75
for
puntos
taking our
básicos,
questions. The
súper
projections
agresivo.
show the unemployment rate rising to 4.4% next year. And historically, that kind of rise in the unemployment rate would typically bring a recession with it. Should we interpret that to mean no soft landing? And is that kind of rise necessary
Ella
to
está
get
hablando
inflation
de
down?
que podría llegar una recesión
Right.
en los Estados Unidos, pero ya
You're
los
right. In
reportes
the
que
SEP,
están ahí
there's
en el
what I
Departamento de
would
Estado
characterize as a
muestran que ya
relatively
estamos en una
modest
recesión.
increase in the unemployment rate from a historical
Es
perspective,
increíble.
given the expected decline in inflation. Now, why is that? So really, that is what we generally expect. Because we see the current
Ella estuvo haciendo
situation
una pregunta
as
con respecto
outside
a
of historical
la
experience in a
tasa
number of
de
ways, and I'll
desempleo
mention
para
a
el
couple of those.
próximo año.
First, and
que
you know
podría
these, but
aumentar.
first, job openings are incredibly high relative to the number of people looking for work. It's
Hay
plausible,
muchísimos
I'll
trabajos
say, that
disponibles,
job openings
muchísimas
could come
personas
down
buscando
significantly,
trabajo
and
en
they
estos
need to,
momentos.
without as much of an increase in unemployment as has happened in earlier historical
Y está
episodes.
aumentando también
So
la
that's
tasa de
one thing.
desempleo. Lo
In
hemos visto
addition, in this
últimamente
cycle,
cómo ha ido en aumento.
longer run inflation expectations have generally been fairly well anchored. As I've said, there's no basis for complacency there. But to the extent that continues to be the case, that should make it easier to restore price stability. And I guess the third thing I would point to that's different this time
Debería
is
ser
that
fácil para el próximo
part of
año
this
que se
inflation is
estabilicen los
caused by this
precios
series of supply shocks that we've had, beginning with
y
the
que
pandemic and really
se
with
pueda
the
nivelar lo que es
reopening
la
of the
oferta y la
economy,
demanda
and
para
more
que también
recently
traiga un
amplified and
impacto en la
added to
inflación.
by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have all contributed to the sharp increase
También
in
a
inflation.
esto
So
ha
these are
contribuido la guerra de
the kinds
Rusia
of
en
events that are not
Ucrania,
really seen
lo
in
cual ha
prior
puesto
business
las
cycles.
cosas un
And
poco
in principle, if those things
peor.
start to get better, and we do see some evidence of the beginnings of that, it's not much more than that, but it's good to see that. For example,
Las cosas han
commodity prices
mejorado,
look like
hemos
they may have
estado
peaked for now.
viendo
Supply chain
un
disruptions
poco de
are
avance,
beginning to resolve. Those
pero hay
developments,
mucho todavía
if
por ver.
sustained, could help ease the pressures on inflation. So let me just say how much these factors will turn out to really matter in this sequence of events, it remains to be seen. We have always
cómo las cosas
understood
pueden ser
that restoring
afectadas
price
con
stability
respecto
while
a
achieving a
todo
relatively
lo que
modest
veamos próximamente,
decline, or rather
si
increase
será un
in
impacto
unemployment and a
bastante
soft landing would be
agresivo
very
positivamente.
challenging.
Tendríamos todavía que
And
ver
we
y
don't know.
esperar
No one knows
los
whether
próximos
this process
reportes
will
que se
lead to a
avecinan
recession, or if so, how
y
significant that
hope for the
recession would
best.
be. That's
Esperar
going to
lo
depend
mejor.
on how quickly wage and price inflation pressures come down, whether expectations remain anchored, and whether, also, do we get more labor supply, which would help as well. In addition, the chances of a soft landing are likely to diminish to the extent that policy needs to be more restrictive or restrictive for longer. Nonetheless, we're committed to
La
getting
póliza
inflation
podría
back
ser
down to
más
2%
restricta
because we think that
o
a failure to
dejarlo
restore price
por
stability
largo
would mean
tiempo
far greater pain later on.
para que podamos también trabajar en la
Is
estabilidad.
still at the top of your list in terms of understanding the labor market and how much room there is there?
Yes, vacancies are still almost 2-to-1 ratio to unemployed people. That and quits are really very good ways to look at how tight the labor market is and how different it is from other cycles, where generally the unemployment rate itself is the single best indicator. We think those things have for quite a time now really added value in terms of understanding where the labor market is.
Nick.
Estuvo haciendo pregunta con respecto a la fuerza laboral.
Nick
y
Timmeros of the Wall Street Journal. You said not too
desempleo.
long ago in describing the policy destination, there's still a way to go. But I imagine you have to have some idea about how you're thinking about your destination, whether it's a stopping point or a pausing point.
Espero que usted tenga
And
alguna
so I
idea
was
del
wondering if you
destino hacia
could
dónde nos
discuss
estamos
how you are
moviendo.
thinking about, as the data come in, where that destination is, how
Mientras
it's
llegan
moving
esas
up,
datas y esos
inflation doesn't
reportes que se
perform
avecinan,
as you expect.
hacia dónde
Do
nos
you want to
dirigimos
have a
nosotros, cuál es
policy rate that's above
nuestro destino.
the underlying inflation rate, for example? And do you have an estimate for where you think the underlying inflation rate might be in the economy right now?
¿Y tienes alguna idea de
Well,
cómo está
so,
la inflación ahora mismo,
again,
el número en la inflación?
We believe that we need to raise our policy stance overall to a level that is restrictive. And by that I mean
Yo creo que deberíamos
meaningfully putting
aumentar
meaningful downward pressure
agresivamente la
on
tasa de
inflation.
interés a
That's
niveles
what we need to
donde serían bastante
see
estrictos,
in the stance of policy.
refiriéndose
We
a
also
las
know that there
pólizas.
are long and variable lengths, particularly as they relate to inflation. So it's a challenging assessment. So what
Es
do you
algo
look
que
at?
no es
You look
fácil.
at broader financial
It's
conditions,
challenging.
as you know, you look at where rates are, real and nominal in some cases. You look at credit spreads. You look at financial conditions indexes. We also, I would think, and you see this this is something we talked about today in the meeting and talk about in all of our meetings. And you see this, I think, in the committee forecast. You want to be at a place where real rates are positive across the entire yield curve. And I think that would be the case if you look at the numbers that we're writing down and think about, you measure those against some sort of forward-looking assessment of inflation expectations. I think you would see at that time, you'd see positive real rates across the yield curve. And that is also an important consideration.
Howard.
Próxima pregunta.
Hi,
Vamos a ver.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thanks for the opportunity. I just want to be clear on the steps. You say it's meeting by meeting, but it sure looks like we're going 75, 50, 25. Is 75 next month the baseline?
Para el próximo mes sería 75
We make
puntos.
one decision per meeting, and the decision we made today was to raise the federal funds rate by 75.
Hoy tomamos la decisión de
You're
aumentarlo
right
a
that
75 puntos básicos.
The median for the year end suggests another 125 basis points in rate increases. But there's another fairly large group that saw 100 basis points addition to where we are today.
Sí, nos estuvimos
So that
reuniendo.
would be 25 basis points less. So,
También
we're going to
instituciones
make that decision
bancarias.
at the meeting.
Algunos
We
grupos
didn't make
decían
that decision today.
125
We didn't
puntos
vote on
básicos,
that.
otros decían 100 puntos
I would say
básicos,
that we're
25
committed
puntos
to getting
básicos.
to a restrictive level of for the federal funds rate and getting there pretty quickly. And that's what we're thinking about.
So just as a follow-up to that, I'm wondering about the sort of risk management considerations here, given there's some discussion now of overdoing it. What's the incentive to continue front-loading right now? Is it lack of progress on inflation seen in the CPI reports, or is it a motivation to get as much done while the job
¿Cuál es la
market is
motivación de aumentar la tasa de
So
interés tan
what we've
agresiva?
seen is
El reporte de la
inflation
inflación, del
has,
CPI,
our expectation has been that
o que no
we would
estamos
begin to see
viendo
inflation come
que
down,
baje
largely because of
agresivamente la
supply
inflación.
side healing. By now, we would have thought that we would have seen some of that. We haven't. We have seen some supply side healing, but inflation has
Hemos
not
visto
really come down.
también la
If you look
demanda
at core PCE
eh,
inflation, which is
que
a
se
good
ha
measure of where inflation is running now.
mantenido, ha llegado
If you look at
un
it on
poco a
a
los
3,
niveles
6, and 12-month trailing annualized
considerables
basis,
que
you'll
son
see
buenos
that,
para la economía,
that
pero
inflation
todavía
is at
tenemos que ver mucho más
4.8%,
y en los
4.5%,
últimos
and
meses ha
4.8%.
aumentado
So that's
entre
that's
4
a
a
pretty good summary
8%.
of where we are with inflation. And that's not where we expected or wanted to be. So what that tells us is that we need to continue, and we can keep doing these, and we did today do another large increase as we approach the level
Lo que
that we
podemos
think
hacer es
we need to
pensar,
get to.
analizar
And we're
la
still
data
discovering
y
what that level
prepararnos
is,
para
but
hacer
people are
otro
writing that
aumento
down
agresivo. Estamos
in their
hablando que el
SEP,
próximo aumento
where they
será
think
el
policy needs
2
to be.
de
So
noviembre.
that's how we're thinking about it.
2 de noviembre, próximo aumento de la tasa de interés. Y va a ser agresivo, según sus palabras.
Financial Times. Chair Powell, how should we interpret the fact that core inflation is still not forecast in the SEP to be back to target in 2025, and yet the dot plot projects cuts as early as 2024? And does that mean there's a level of inflation above the 2%
Ella
target
está hablando
that
de
the Fed is
acuerdo
willing to tolerate?
a varias encuestas y algunas
So
organizaciones
I guess
muy
core is at
reconocidas que han hablado
2.1 in
que no creen que la
2025.
tasa
In the
vaya a
median
bajar
and
al
and
2%
headline is at
para el
2.0.
2025.
So that's pretty close. I mean, we write down our forecasts and
Él
we
dice que
figure out what the
están muy
median is and
cerca
we publish
los
it. So
cálculos que ellos han hecho
it's not
de poder ver una
I would
inflación
say
para el
that if,
2025
if,
al 2%, lo que es
actually if the
saludable para
economy
la
followed
economía.
this path, this would be a pretty good outcome. But you're right, it is a tenth higher than 2%.
Okay, just as a quick follow-up, I mean, if the concern is that underlying inflation is becoming more entrenched perhaps each month, then why forego the more aggressive 100 basis point increase today? And does that risk having to do more later on?
Yeah, so we, as we said,
¿Por qué no
at the
aumentaron
last
100
press
puntos
conference and in
básicos
between
si es así, de
that one
acuerdo a lo
and
que él
this
había
one, we said
respondido a la
that
primera
we would
pregunta?
make our decision based on the overall
Ahora él
data
está
coming in. So
respondiendo.
if you remember, we got a surprisingly low reading in July and then a surprisingly high
Recuerda que
reading for
tuvimos
August. So I think you
el
have to,
reporte del
you
CPI
can't really, you
que
never
nos
want to
sorprendió
overreact too much to any one data point.
en
So if
julio
you
y el
look,
mes
you look at them
pasado,
together, and as I just mentioned, if
saben,
you
bajó la
really
tasa
look
de-
at this
de-
year's inflation, 3.6
la
and
inflación de
12-month trailing, you
8.5
see
8.3%.
inflation is running too high. It's
El
running
presidente hasta estaba haciendo
4.5% or above.
una fiesta para
You don't need to
celebrar
know much more than
en la
that.
Casa
If that's the
Blanca.
one thing
Es
you know
increíble.
that this committee is committed to getting to a meaningfully restrictive stance of policy and staying there until we feel confident that inflation is coming down. That's how we think about it.
Victoria.
Hi, Victoria Guida with Politico. I wanted to ask about the balance sheet. You all have left open the possibility that you might sell mortgage-backed securities, but we've seen significant slowing in the housing market. Mortgage
la van
rates
a
have gone up
aumentar
significantly, and I'm just wondering whether conditions
2
there
de noviembre
might
próximamente
affect
y va
your
a ser un
plans
aumento
for
bastante
how quickly
agresivo.
you have the runoff on the MBS
También.
side.
So what we said, as you know, was that we would consider that once balance sheet runoff is well underway. I would say it's not something we're considering right now and not something I expect to be considering in the near term. It's just, it's something I think we will turn to, but the time
Ellos
for
van a
turning
admitir
to
que
it
estamos en una
has
recesión,
not come and is not close.
que el país entró en una
Will
recesión.
conditions
Busquen
in the
el
housing
reporte.
market affect
El
that
reporte está
decision?
bien claro.
I think a
Lo
number of
reconoce
things
también
might
Bill
affect that decision.
Clinton
But the main thing is
y
we're
otros
not considering that
presidentes
decision, and
que
I don't
fueron
expect that
presidentes
we
de la
will
nación.
anytime soon.
Ellos lo van a reconocer, Josué, después de las elecciones de medio tiempo.
Neil Irwin with Axios. A number of commentators have come to the view, and including over at the World
Reserva
Bank,
Federal
that simultaneous global tightening around the
acaba de
world
aumentar la tasa de
creates a
interés.
risk of a global recession that's worse
Aumento
than is
Histórico.
necessary to bring inflation down. How do you
Nuevamente.
see that risk? How do you think of coordination with your fellow central bankers? And is there much risk of overdoing it on a global level?
So we actually, my colleagues and I, a number of my FOMC colleagues and I just got back from one of our frequent trips to Basel, Switzerland, to meet with other senior central bank officials from around the world. We are in pretty regular contact, and we exchange. Of course, we all serve a domestic mandate, domestic objectives, in our case, the dual mandate, maximum employment price stability. but we regularly discuss what we're seeing in terms of our own economy and international spillovers. And it's a very ongoing, constant kind of a process. So we are very aware of what's going on in other economies around the world and what that means for us and vice versa. The forecast that we put together, that our staff puts together and that we put together on our own, always try to take all of that into account. I mean, I can't say that we do it perfectly, but it's not as if
No
we
puedo
don't
decir que
think
todo lo
about,
hacemos perfectamente,
the
pero yo en mi
policy
equipo tratamos
decisions,
de hacer los
monetary policy
cálculos,
and
trabajar
otherwise,
y
the
hacer
economic
todo lo que
developments
podamos
that are taking place in
para llevar
major
adelante
economies that
algún
can have
cambio
effect
en
on
las
the US
pólizas
economy.
y todo lo
That
que
is very much
necesitamos
baked into
para también
our
dar
own forecast and our own
lo que es
understanding
un
of
reporte
you know,
de la
of the
economía y
US
todo lo que está
economy as
pasando en el
best we
país.
can. It won't be perfect.
Sí,
So,
pero no todo puede
you
ser
know,
perfecto.
I don't see it's hard to talk about collaboration in a world where people have very different levels of interest rates. If you remember, there were coordinated cuts and raises and things like that at various times. But really we're in very different situations. But I will tell you that our contact is more or less ongoing, and it's not coordination, but there's a lot of information sharing, and we all, I think, are informed by what other important economies that are important to the United States are doing.
Y no sé por qué tiene que hablar de otras economías, pero bueno, así está la cosa.
Greg Torres from Bloomberg. Chair Powell, you talked about some ways the higher interest rates are affecting the economy, but
Tú has
we've
hablado
also
de que
seen a resilient
la tasa
labor
de
market
interés,
with
estos
durable
aumentos están
consumption,
afectando la economía
strong
y a
corporate
varios
profits.
sectores.
And I'm wondering what your story is
¿Cuál
on
es tu
the
historia?
resilience of the economy. After all, you and your colleagues said, well, we started tightening in March when we were talking about interest rates in the future.
Me gustaría saber
and
cuál es tu
the
historia, lo que
Treasury
piensas
rates
tú
moved up,
y
so
tu
we should
equipo
have had a lot of tightening.
desde el momento que empezaron a aumentar la tasa de interés en marzo.
Why is the economy, in your view,
Y hemos aumentado ya 3 puntos básicos de la tasa de interés.
You're right.
esto
Of
puede
course, the
afectar aún
labor
más la
market in
economía.
particular has been very strong. But there are the
Bueno,
sectors of the
nuevamente,
economy that
a
are
repetir lo mismo, la
most
fuerza
interest
laboral
rate
se mantiene
sensitive
todavía en una buena
certainly
posición, está diciendo él.
showing the effects of our tightening. And of course, the obvious example is housing, where you see declining activity and
Estamos viendo el
different
sector de las
kinds
casas,
and
que estamos
housing
viendo
price
una
increases
decaída
moving down. So we're
en
having an
los
effect
precios que han
on
empezado a bajar.
on interest-sensitive spending. I think through exchange rates, we're having an effect on exports and imports. I think so. All of that's happening, but you're right. And we've said this. This is a strong, robust economy. People have savings on
Enviaron
their
3
balance
estímulos
sheet
económicos,
from the period when they
printearon
couldn't
más de
spend and where they were
3.5
getting government transfers. There's
trillones de
still very
dólares.
significant savings out there,
Y
although
estamos viendo
not as much at the
cómo
lower
está
end
afectado
of the
también la
income spectrum,
inflación,
but still
aparte del mal
some
manejo y tantas
savings
cosas
out
que
there to
están
support
sucediendo en esta economía.
growth. The states are very flush with cash, so
Los
there's
estados
good
tienen
reason to think
suficiente
that
dinero en
this will
efectivo en
continue
estos
to be
momentos
a reasonably strong economy. Now,
y
the
están
data
fuertes en la economía en estos momentos,
sort of
está diciendo él.
are showing that growth is going to be below trend this year. We think of trend as being about 1.8% or in that range. We're forecasting growth well below that, and most forecasters are.
Se espera el
But you're right,
crecimiento de
there's certainly a
1.8% y se
possibility
espera que sea
that growth can be
el
stronger
averaje
than
es
that.
1.8%
And
y se
you know,
espera
that's
que
a
sea
good
un
thing
poco por abajo de eso.
because that means the economy will be more resistant to to a
Puede ser que
significant
esto sea que la
downturn.
economía sea más
But of course,
resistente
we are focused
a
on the
esto.
thing I started with, which is getting inflation back down to
Pero bueno,
2%.
nosotros estamos enfocados, como lo había dicho desde el
we
principio, en
we
traer la
can't fail to
inflación
do
abajo a
that.
2% en estos
That's
momentos.
if we were to fail
Y
to
no
do that, that
podemos
would be the
fallar en
thing
eso.
that would be most painful for the people that we
Y si
serve.
fallamos,
So
sería muy
for now,
doloroso para
that
las
has to be
personas.
our overarching focus. And you see that, I think, in the SEP, in the levels of rates that we'll be moving to reasonably quickly, assuming things turn out roughly in line with the SEP. So that's how we think about it.
Ese es nuestro enfoque en estos momentos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In a world of euphemisms that we live in here with
Aumento de la tasa de
below
interés
trend growth
histórico en
and
los Estados
modest
Unidos.
increase in unemployment, I'm wondering if I could ask you a couple of
75
direct
puntos
questions for the
básicos.
American people. Do the odds now favor, given where you
Inflación
are and
más
where you're
alta en
going with
40
interest rates,
años.
favor a recession? 4.4% unemployment is about 1.3 million jobs. Is that acceptable job loss? And
4.4
then
tasa de
given that
desempleo es
the
alrededor de
data you
4,
look at is backward looking and the
1.3
lags in your
millones de
policy are
trabajos,
forward looking and you don't know what they
está
are,
diciendo él.
how will you know or will you know if you've gone too far?
¿Cómo tú
So
sabes
I don't,
si han ido
I
ustedes
don't know what the
demasiado
odds
lejos?
are. I think that there's a very high likelihood that we'll have
Muchos bancos
a
están
period of
criticando la alza de
what I
interés
mentioned is
de la
below
Fed.
trend growth, by
Y
which I
algunos
mean
economistas
much lower growth,
importantes
and we're seeing
reconocidos
that
también
now.
están diciendo que
So
esto es una
the
locura
median
lo que han
forecast,
hecho
I think, this year for
desde
among my
que
colleagues
empezaron a
in
aumentar la
the
tasa de
is
interés,
0.2%
principalmente
growth. So
tan
that's
agresivo.
very slow growth, and then below trend next year. I think the median was 1.2, also well below. So that's a slower. That's a very slow level of growth, and it could give rise to increases in unemployment. But I think that is something that we think we need to have, and we think we need to have softer labor market conditions as well.
Regalamos un like ustedes que están aquí, le
We're never
agradezco
going to say
mucho.
that there
Gracias a
are
todos
too
ustedes
many
por sus
people working,
comentarios.
but the real point is this: inflation. What we hear from people when we meet with them is that they really are suffering from inflation, and if we
La
want to
cuestión
set
aquí es
ourselves
esta.
up,
La
really,
inflación
really
tenemos que
light the
trabajarla
way to another
agresivamente.
period
Cuando
of
escuchamos de las
very
personas,
strong labor
lo primero
market,
que
we have
dicen es
got
que
to
están
get
siendo muy
inflation
afectadas su
behind us.
economía por esta
I wish there
inflación.
were a painless way to do that. There isn't. So what we need to
Y
do is
tenemos que
get
seguir
rates
aumentando
up
la tasa de
to the point
interés.
where we're
Si hay
putting
una
meaningful downward
manera de
pressure
hacer esto
on
que sea
inflation.
menos
And
dolorosa,
that's what
no la hay en
we're
estos
doing.
momentos.
And we certainly don't hope, we certainly haven't given up the idea that we can have a relatively modest increase in unemployment. Nonetheless, we need to complete this task.
Tenemos que terminar con esta tarea.
If you've gone too far.
It's hard to hypothetically deal with that question. I mean, our really tight focus now continues to be ongoing rate increases to get the policy rate up.
Nuestro enfoque en estos
where it needs
momentos,
to be.
nuevamente,
And as
repite
I
esto
said, you
como
can
ya
look
por
at
5
this
veces,
SEP
es seguir
as
aumentando
today's
agresivamente la tasa de
estimate
interés
of where we think those
próximamente
rates would be. Of course, they will evolve over time.
para ver una decaída en la inflación.
I wanted to follow up with what you just mentioned about the labor market. You've said several times that
Quiero
to
preguntar
have the labor
sobre
market we want, we need price stability. And you've suggested maybe there isn't a trade-off in the long run. But in the short run, there is a lot of concern, as people have been
estás
expressing
hablando
here,
de la
about higher
demanda, estás hablando de la
unemployment as a result
oferta.
of these rate hikes, or as a result of the rate hikes. So can you explain, though, what about high inflation now
¿Tú puedes explicar
threatens the job market? I mean, you've
ahora el
suggested
problema que
that
tenemos de la alta inflación
high
y lo que está
inflation
pasando en el mercado laboral
will eventually lead to a weaker job market?
y
So
esta
can you spell
amenaza
that out
para
a
el
little
mercado
more?
laboral, donde vemos a muchas personas
So for
perdiendo sus empleos
starters,
también
people are
en
seeing their wage
combinación con esta
increases, their
alta inflación.
wage increases eaten up by inflation. So if your family is one where you spend most of your paycheck, every paycheck cycle,
Si tu familia es de
on
las
gas,
que gasta
food,
casi todo su cheque de
transportation,
trabajo en
clothing,
inflación,
basics of life,
en
and prices go
transporte,
up the way they've been
por
going
esta
up, you're in
inflación,
trouble right away.
en ropa,
You don't have a cushion, and
no te
this is
queda
very
mucho.
painful for people at the lower end of the income and wealth spectrum. So that's what we're hearing from people
Claro.
is,
No te sobra
very much
mucho
that inflation
y
is
estas son
really
las
hurting.
personas que más
So how do we get rid of inflation?
están
And
sufriendo
as I mentioned,
impacto
it would be
económico,
nice if there were, a way to just
refiriéndose a la
wish it
inflación.
away, but there isn't. We have to get supply and demand back into alignment, and the way we do
Tenemos
that
que
is by
traer
slowing the
nuevamente,
economy.
volver a
Hopefully,
decir,
we do that
tenemos
by
que
slowing the
traer
economy, and we
alinear
see
lo que es la
some
oferta y
softening
la
of labor
demanda
market conditions, and we see
a los niveles que
a
son
big contribution
buenos para la
from
economía.
supply
Eso lo
side,
tenemos que hacer.
improvements and things like that. But none of that is guaranteed.
Pero nada de
In
esto
any
es
case,
garantizado.
our job is to
Podemos
deliver
hacer
price
usar nuestras
stability. And I think
herramientas
you can
para
think of price
lograr
stability as
y hacer esto.
an asset that just delivers large benefits to society over a long period of time. We really
A
saw
largo
that
tiempo
for
esto va a
a
traer un
long
gran
time. The
alivio
United
para la
States had
sociedad y para los
2%
americanos
inflation,
aquí
didn't move around
como
much,
en
and
el
that was
país.
enormously beneficial to the public that we serve. And we have to get back to that
Y
and
tenemos que
keep it for
que
another
hacerlo
long
porque
period
no
of time.
tenemos otra salida.
To pull back from the
Y
task of
tenemos que
doing that
tratar
is
de
you're
llegar al
just
2%.
postponing. The record shows that if you postpone that, the delay is only likely to lead to more pain. So,
Y tenemos que hacerlo
I think we're
agresivamente
moving
porque si no, esto podría durar
to do
aún
what we
más
need to do and do
tiempo
our
para poder
jobs,
ver esos
and
niveles
and
de la
that's what you see us
inflación
doing.
a donde lo queremos ver. nuevamente ustedes saben, el 2%.
Thank you for taking the question,
La
Mr. Chairman.
inflación se
Ed Lomas,
encontraba
Fox Business.
1.4%
So you had said that Americans and businesses need to feel
en
some
el
economic
2020.
pain as we go forward. How long
Deje
from
que
here
eso
should Americans be
trate de
prepared
analizar eso.
for that economic pain?
1.4%. Increíble.
How long? I mean, it really depends on how long it takes for wages and more than that, prices to come down, for inflation to come down. And what you see in our projections today is that inflation moves down, significantly over the course of next year, and then more the next year after that. And
Lo que ustedes han
I
podido ver
think,
que si seguimos así podríamos
once
ver
you're
la
on that path,
tasa de interés
that's a
bajando
good thing, and things will start to feel better to
próximo
people.
año,
They'll feel
principio
lower
del
inflation.
próximo
They'll feel
año.
the economy's improving, and also if our projections are
Y
close
si
to right,
nuestra
you'll
proyección
see
sale
that
todo bien,
that the costs
se
in
va a ir bajando lo
unemployment
que es el dolor y
are
veremos
they're
también la
meaningful, and
inflación
they're certainly very meaningful
haciendo
to the
menos
people who
daño
lose
aquí en
their
los
jobs.
americanos.
And we talk about that in our meetings.
Hemos hablado de eso
Quite a lot.
mucho del
But,
problema
at
también
the same
con
time, we'd be setting
la
the
tasa de
economy up
desempleo,
for another long
de
period.
lo que está
This
sucediendo.
era has been noted for very
Y
long
todo esto es una
expansions. We've had
combinación
3 of the 4 longest in measured history since we got
de la economía,
inflation under
también
control. And
combinación
that's not an accident. So when inflation is low and stable, you can
la
have these
inflación,
9, 10, 11,
la oferta y la
10-year,
demanda.
anyway, expansions. And you can see what we saw in 2018, 19, and 20, which was very low unemployment, the biggest wage gains going to people at the low end of the spectrum, the smallest racial gaps that we've seen
Y ustedes saben lo que vimos en 2020, la tasa de desempleo
we want to get back to that.
muy
But
baja.
to get there, we're going to have to get supply
Si
and
queremos
demand
regresar
back,
ahí nuevamente,
in
tenemos que
alignment, and
alinear
that's going to take
la
tight,
oferta a la demanda, trabajar
tight
con
monetary policy
el
for a
aumento
period
también
of time.
de la tasa de interés y
What
nuestras
is that
pólizas.
economic pain in your mind? Is it job losses? Is it higher interest rates on credit cards? What is that economic pain?
So it's all of those things.
¿Qué es lo que
Higher
más
interest rates, slower
doloroso
growth,
para la
and a
economía?
softening labor
Pérdida de
market
trabajo,
are all painful
inflación,
for
dice,
the
todo
public that
esto
we
es
serve.
doloroso,
But they're not as painful as failing to restore
pero
price
no está
stability
más doloroso
and then having
que
to come
fallar
back
en
and
hacer el
do it,
trabajo para bajar esta inflación.
down the road again, and doing it at a time when actually now people have really come to expect high inflation. If
Y más ahora en este
the
tiempo donde las
concept of
personas
high
están
inflation
esperando
becomes entrenched in
y
people's
están tratando
economic
con
thinking
esta
about their
inflación
decisions,
alta,
then sort of getting back to price stability, the cost of getting back to price stability just
necesitamos
rises.
llegar a la
And so we
estabilidad
want
de
to
los
avoid that.
precios.
We want to act aggressively now.
Tenemos
and
que
get this job
seguir
done and keep at it until
nosotros
it's done.
actuando y trabajando agresivamente.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. Nicole Goodkind, CNN Business. Existing home sales have fallen for 7 months straight. Mortgage rates are
Las
at their
casas
highest level
disponibles
since
han bajado
2008.
por 7 meses
Yet mortgage demand
consecutivos
increased this week, and housing prices are still elevated. Now, at the end of
y
your
los
June
precios
press
de la
conference,
casa
you mentioned plans to
siguen
reset
elevados.
the housing market. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you mean when you say reset and
Ella está hablando
what
de
you
los
think it will take to
casas
actually get there.
disponibles en comparación a los
So
precios de
when
las
I
casas
say
que siguen elevados en
reset,
los
I'm not
últimos
looking
7
at a
meses.
particular specific, set of data or anything. What I'm really saying is that we've had a time of a red hot housing market all over the country
Tuvimos
where,
un mercado
famously
súper
houses were
caliente
selling to the first buyer
en
at
bienes
10%
raíces,
above the ask before even seeing the house, that kind of thing. So
donde las personas ni tan siquiera
there was
iban
a
a
big
ver las
imbalance
casas y
between supply
compraban
and
las
demand.
casas.
Housing prices were
La
going
miraban
up at
por
an
un video
unsustainably
o
fast
unas
level. So
fotos.
the deceleration in housing prices that we're seeing should help bring sort of
Estamos
prices
viendo
more closely in
la
line with rents and other
desaceleración
housing
ahora
market
mismo
fundamentals.
en lo que es el
That's
mercado
a
de
good
bienes
thing. For the
raíces.
longer term, what we need is supply and demand to get better aligned so that housing
Nuevamente,
prices go up at a
a
reasonable
largo tiempo
level,
lo que necesitamos ver
at a
que
reasonable
se
pace,
alineen la
and
demanda y la
that
oferta,
people can afford houses again. And I think
y eso
we
queremos que
probably
las
in the housing
personas
market
puedan
have to go
nuevamente
through a
poder
correction
comprar su casa
to get
y no
back to
tener
that
que
place.
pagar estos
There
precios.
are also longer run issues though with the housing market. As you know, it's difficult to find lots now close enough to cities and things like that. So builders are having a
En estos
hard time
momentos es
getting
muy
zoning
difícil
and
encontrar
lots
lo
and
que es
workers and
terrenos
materials and things like that.
disponibles
But
a
from
las
a sort of
ciudades
business cycle
grandes
standpoint,
en estos
this
momentos porque hubo un
difficult
boom muy grande y el
correction
mercado
should
estuvo
put
muy
the housing
caliente
market back into
los
better
últimos
balance.
meses.
Shelter made up such a large part of this hot CPI report that we saw. Do you think that there is a lag and that we will see that come down in the coming months, or do you think that there's still this imbalance that needs to be addressed?
No, I think that shelter inflation is going to remain high for some time. You know, we're looking for it to come down, but it's not exactly clear when that will happen. So it may take some time. So I think you know, hope for the best, plan for the worst. So I think on shelter inflation, you just got to assume that it's going to remain pretty high for a while.
Okay, we'll go to Jean for the last question.
Hi, Jean Young with Market News. You've talked about the need to get real rates into positive territory, and you said earlier that policy is just moving into that territory now. So I'm curious, how restrictive is rates at 4.6% expected? Is that expected to be next year? How restrictive?
Wow.
So I
Ha
think if
subido
you look,
3% en estos
you know,
momentos
when
la
we get
tasa de
to,
interés en lo
if
que
we
va del
assume we
año. Le
do
está
get to that
preguntando
level,
qué tan estrictos serían las
I think
pólizas
is likely.
si sigue el aumento de la tasa de
You know,
interés por
what you're
arriba
going to
del
do is you're going to
4%,
adjust that
4.6%.
for some forward looking measure of inflation. And, you know, that could be, you pick your measure. It could be, you know, there are all kinds of different things you could pick and you get, but what you'll get is a positive number. In all cases, you will get forward inflation expectations in the short term, I think, that are going to be, assuming that we're doing our jobs appropriately, that will be significant. So you'll have a positive federal funds rate.
Un impacto
At that
positivo
point, which
para lo
could
que
be
nosotros
1%
queremos
or
hacer
so.
con
But I
inflación,
mean, I don't know exactly what it would be, but it would be
refiriéndose a
significantly
bajarla
positive
a los
when we get to
niveles
that level. And let
que
me
son
say, you know, we've written down
saludables para la
what we
economía.
think is a plausible path for the federal funds rate. The path that we actually execute will be enough. It will be enough to restore price stability. So this is something that, as you can see, they've moved up, and we're going to continue to watch incoming data and the evolving outlook and ask ourselves whether our policy is in the right place as we go.
Vamos a seguir reuniéndonos,
Thank you very much.
viéndonos también, viendo todos los reportes de todos los meses del CPI para poder tomar la decisión correcta y esperando que todo salga bien. Señores, acabamos de ver la Reserva Federal, el presidente Jerome Powell, hablando, dirigiéndose a la nación, hablando sobre lo que se ve a venir. Estuvo hablando también con respecto a la tasa de interés, lo que se espera para el próximo año. Estuvo hablando también de bienes raíces. Acaban de aumentar la tasa de interés en los Estados Unidos, 75 puntos básicos, señores. Muy, muy agresivo. Les quiero agradecer a todos ustedes. Yo sé que hemos estado ausentes ya por alrededor de 4 o 5 días. Regresaremos nuevamente con muy buen contenido. Tenemos nuevos invitados. No olviden suscribirse, denle like al video si encuentra valor. Y amigos, síganme.
Getter ha llegado. La nueva red social protegiendo la libertad de expresión. La plataforma de libre pensamiento ha llegado, con tecnología superior. Se acabó la venta de tus datos personales. Basta la censura. Basta de no ser libre. Basta ya. Getter ha llegado. Es la hora de decir lo que quieres de la manera que quieres. Descárgala ya.
Nuevamente, aquí está empezando Jerome Powell. Yo creo que lo empezaron desde el principio. Vamos a quitar esto. Síganme en Getter, bajen la aplicación, la red social con mayor crecimiento ahora mismo en los Estados Unidos. ¿Ok? Ahí lo pueden bajar. Getter, G-E-T-T-R. Nos vemos más tarde hoy a las 8:30 de la noche. Amigos míos, un abrazo para todos ustedes. Nos vemos próximamente. Bajen la aplicación Getter y síganme. Una plataforma con un crecimiento brutal, donde no hay censura, donde no venden su información privada.
Getter ha llegado. La nueva red social protegiendo la libertad de expresión. La plataforma de libre pensamiento ha llegado, con tecnología superior. Se acabó la venta de tus datos personales. Basta la censura. Basta de no ser libre. Basta ya. Getter ha llegado. Es la hora de decir lo que quieres de la manera que quieres. Descárgala ya.
Ahí está, señores. Bajen la aplicación Getter y síganme. Ahí vamos a estar dando información sin pelos en la lengua. Estaremos en vivo en Getter más seguido. Gracias nuevamente. Nos vemos nuevamente esta noche a las 8:30. Acabamos de traerle la información del aumento de la tasa de interés. Un abrazo para todos ustedes. Hasta luego.